Hi, my name is Katie, and this is my Mammalogy Oral Exam Part 2. First, we're going to talk about wildlife disease impacts. We're going to talk about two of the diseases that Dr. Brown talked to us about a couple of months ago. So first, the hemorrhagic disease and then the chronic wasting disease. The hemorrhagic disease is the most common amongst white-tailed deer. There are two different types, so episodic or the blue tongue. So understanding which one is which helps us to manage and prevent. So, in summary, basically, it just causes leaky vessels, and the gladulation system actually becomes overwhelmed, and then it starts to create blood clots throughout the body. So, the hosts that are typically for this are ruminants. So, and because they're very vulnerable to disease, so you would see this very prominently within white-tailed deer. The vectors are arthropod borne, so they are actually found in these blood-sucking midges. You may know them as no or various different types of mosquitoes. So they actually will bite the host, and then it will spread in that way. So in terms of management and treatment, it doesn't affect humans that we know of thus far, and domestics are rarely affected. However, vaccines are available, but are not really that reliable. It needs monitoring, but because it actually doesn't affect the population quite that much, there is a lot of emotional involvement because you see a lot of dead deer, and then people think there's a really high population issue. However, there really is not. And so, because of that, there doesn't need to be a lot of change in management, just maybe some education to the public and changed hunting practices. And so these are what the midges would look like. And so they will attach to the body in multiple ones and will cause the spread in that way. In terms of the chronic wasting disease, this is actually a neurological disease. So basically, it turns the nervous system into the spongy structure. So the bovine spongiform encephalogeny actually would be like mad cow disease. And so this is not through a vector like with an organism, but rather with these prawns that you would see within the body. So they're abnormal shaped proteins. And then once they are abnormal, they are no longer recognized and cannot break down. And so they start to build up. And then this will create these um, neurological issues. So typical hosts would be like your deer, elk, or moose. Domestics don't seem to be too affected in like field studies, and there are no CWD cases in humans at this time, but it is of somewhat concern. Management can be very hard to control because a lot of the symptoms can also look like other things, such as a deer that has just given birth. And transmission creates an issue because it's transmitted through bodily fluids. So if a deer excretes and then another deer comes by and grazes, they're going to ingest that. Impacts are uncertain at this time. If it's high enough, it can create population issues, but it does have to be pretty high, and that does depend on the location in which they are found. In terms of management, the best thing that we can do is prevent. There are no treatments at this time, like a vaccine, but keeping deer from congregating, and then also educating others about this, so that if hunters take deer across a location, or if they're using salt licks and things of that nature. All right, let's switch gears into echolocation. So echolocation is incredibly interesting, in my opinion. So there's actually two orders that you can find this in. That would be the order Chiropetra, which would be your bats, and then the order Cetacean. So what a basic just summary of echolocation would be a sound that's radiated into the environment, and then the animal will actually send that out and wait for this rebound to either locate their prey or to understand their surroundings. So it can kind of work similar to sonar if you think about the bat. So they use these ultrasonic sounds and clicks that's formed in the larynx, and then through the nostrils or either the mouth, they create this sound picture. So you can kind of see that in this photo here. And they have multiple different adaptations for this. The ear would be one of those. So you can see the pinna is larger, and then the tragus is larger. They can also have a nose piece that would be useful for that as well. This can be seen in cetacean as well. We're going to look at that a little bit later on. But in terms of bats, so it's out of our hearing range. We can't really hear that, so we do have to slow that down. So when we slow that down using different detectors, it would sound a little something like this. Oops. So that would be what it would sound like. This is actually a graph of a pallid bat, and that was what that noise was from. So focusing on the brown long-eared bat, there was a photograph in our lecture from this bat, but we didn't really talk about it, so I wanted to kind of go into that. They are considered whispering bats because they actually have the quietest echolocation of all other bats, and they're common throughout the United Kingdom, Ireland, Isles of Man, but they are actually declining in Britain due to fragmentation and some other issues with their food sources. So they do have the most quiet echolocation. They are highly adapted for hearing these sounds. So you can see their ears and then their tragus. So the tragus and their ears are so sensitive. The pinna is so sensitive they can actually hear the flapping of a wing from a moth. From a pretty far distance. So they will actually swoop through the air, like you can see in this black line here, and they are sending out these clicks through their nasal passages. And those clicks can be heard at about 25 to 50 kilohertz. And like again, they can swoop and dive to do this to catch their prey. So again, we can hear them using a heterodyne bat detector or an anabat detector. So in a brown long-eared bat, you would hear something like this. Thankfully, I have actually had the privilege of working with some of these anabat detectors, and it's really fun to actually go out and look for bats using this method. Okay, moving into the order of cetacean. So that's another order that actually can do echolocation. We'll see some of this within the beluga whale, in fact. So looking at them and some of their key characteristics, you have your male and female. You can identify them. The male has almost this exclamation mark with the genital groove in the belly button area, but then you have the female that has these mammillary grooves, and it's more like a fork shaped. Females are typically smaller than the males. You can see that here. They come in at about 3 to 4 meters, while males are around 4.6. Their color is a beautiful white color that blends in with their Arctic surroundings. But when they're born, they're actually this gray color that almost is similar to like a dolphin. But then they will actually later on develop into that white color that we typically see with them. They have a peg-like teeth that's continual grow with the cementum. The cementum is really important because it's a calcified structure on the tooth, and it actually covers this tooth and will help it to anchor to the mandible or the maxilla. Okay, so they actually do not have a fin, and their scientific name, Delphin apterus, it actually means a dolphin without a fin. So you can see that the dolphins here have a fin and they do not. This enables them to be able to swim underneath the ice in their Arctic regions when they're hunting for food without having any restrictions there. So that's pretty interesting. 40% of their body weight is for blubber. I think that this makes sense as they are in Arctic regions. Most of the waters that they're in are actually a temperature of about 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so very cold, and they do need the ability to stay warm with that blubber. Um, Okay, and so in terms of their geographical region, we've mentioned this already, but they live in Arctic areas, so northern hemispheric areas like Alaska, Canada, Russia, Greenland. They actually will return to their birth areas for hunting and breeding each year. They will actually move depending on the season. So if it is summer, they will actually live in more shallow waters, but if it is winter, they will actually move to about 1,000 meters to deeper water. Sometimes they'll also hang out in rivers, estuaries, and deltas, just depending on the season. Okay. Their social structure is pretty unique, so you can find groups of 100 or more, or you can find smaller groups that are, sometimes even under 10 whales. They have a really flexible structure. Like with killer whales, you see that they're very tied to like their maternal pod, that one that they're born in, and they normally typically don't leave. But with belugas, they'll actually move back and forth between pods. So it's not, they don't really have strong ties with their pods. Okay, so like I said, they actually do participate in echolocation. So one of their most unique features is they have a lot of different types of sounds, and they can also be called canaries of the sea. They have whistles, squeals, moos, chirps, and clicks, and that is used for echolocation. So they have this specialized melon here that will actually help them to send out these frequencies, and then that will bounce back to them to help them to hunt. And what's even more interesting is they actually have really good eyesight, but they still utilize this for hunting. If you were to hear them in the wild, this is similar to what they would sound like. Okay, So those noises will be similar to what you would hear, and as you can tell, they're pretty vast. Okay. In terms of reproduction, you typically see that late winter to early spring, and they don't become sexually mature until they're about 9 to 14 years of age. And then in terms of gestation, there's almost like a 15-month gestation period, which is pretty long. And that leads into the issue that they are currently endangered. With a lot of habitat loss, their environments are becoming contaminated. There's non-sustainable fishing, so limiting their resources, becoming beached, and then of course noise pollution. Their conservation status, they are declining and they are experiencing issues in that. The reason I chose this, I have a lot of personal experiences with them, so I just have a love for marine mammals, but also I know SeaWorld gets kind of a bad rap, but I know some folks that actually work for SeaWorld and SeaWorld Rescue, and they talk very highly of how they actually help out these animals. Okay, so moving on to another personal connection. So we're going to be looking at the order of Perissodactyla from the family Equidae. So I have a previous history with riding horses, and so we're going to look at an invasive horse that I think is pretty incredible and a really interesting topic. So banker horses. So I grew up riding horses, and I think that when we think about horses, we don't think about maybe an invasive impact that they may have. So within the coast of North Carolina, near where I'm from, near Morehead City, you will actually find two different islands called the Core Banks and the Shackleford. Together, those are actually called the Outer Banks. And in the Outer Banks, there's about 100 plus horses, and they are located on this island. They're all on these islands. They have a height average, so horses are measured in hands, so they're about 13.5 hands or 52 inches, and they weigh between 800 to 11,000 pounds or 1,000 pounds. And that's pretty small for a horse. Typically, they're much larger. This was my Bavarian horse that I had, and he was about 15.5 hands, if that gives you any comparison. So horses are herd animals, so they will herd in at least a group of 4, and then they have varying colors. So they can be like a really dark brown, they can be a tan, but you will not see a white banker horse. Okay, so in terms of their range, their native range is highly debated in the coast of North Carolina, and there's a lot of local myths. However, we do know that horses actually were, of course, native to Africa and then Central and Western Asia. In the previous millions of years. However, how the banker horses actually got to North Carolina was probably through Spaniards. We know that a lot of the horses that are in North America as of today came from these Spaniard settlers and brought them over. And that's probably what we're seeing here with the banker horses. So you will find them from the Virginia line, and that will move down the coast of North Carolina, and that will actually come in even a little more south. But there are some wild Mustangs in other areas as well. It's not just in the coast of North Carolina. You can find them out west as well, located in this map here. Okay. So how do they actually impact the environment? Well, they cause a loss of native vegetation and a loss of the native wildlife due to similar impacts. So when they graze, they actually cut really close to the roots, which does not allow for that native vegetation to grow back. And then that creates an issue for the local wildlife. But then they also dig holes. So they look for fresh water. They can't drink salt water, obviously. So they will dig down deep into the water table to try to find a clean water source. And so that causes a big problem because it causes degraded land, and then it causes a lot of erosion. If you've ever had horses or known someone that's had horses, you know that this is what your yard will look like. And thus the Outer Banks are also looking like that as well. In terms of a solution, this is an incredibly hard thing, and I know this from a personal standpoint, is that the people of the Outer Banks and the coast of North Carolina, they love the horses, the locals love them, and also the tourists. They get a lot of public attention. There's a lot of tourist tours and things that they go on, and so it's really hard to manage these because a lot of people don't look at them as being invasive, even though that they are by the federal government. So management is being done, but it's being done very carefully because it is so controversial. So one of the things that they are doing is trying to help kind of keep them isolated to certain areas rather than them moving across. But I know that that's been a challenge also trying to help the public understand the importance of that. Okay. So let's talk about the paper section that we focused on. So we looked at the observed and predicted effects of climate change on Arctic caribou and reindeer, and we looked at 5 different subspecies of Ringifer pterandus. So that would be the Prairie caribou, the Salvanbard reindeer, the reindeer of Scandinavia and northern Eurasia, the caribou of northern Quebec and Labrador, Canada, and then the barren ground caribou. In terms of their geographic location, you can find that most of the subspecies that we just covered that would be referred to as caribou can be found in North America. So that would be in that orange there, but also the subspecies in Eurasia are actually referred to as reindeer, and that can be found in the purple section there. Some of their key features are that they are about 4 feet tall, so you can see that in this image here. They weigh between 250 to 700 pounds, just depending. And their lifespan is about 10 to 15 years. Their mating season is typically from mid-October or early October, and then their gestation periods from October to June. Both males and females do have antlers. Okay, so for their habitat uses, so foraging for them is incredibly critical during the summer months because there's a limited window in which they can actually forage for green food that is coming through the tundra. So they actually will use these ice bridges, if you will, in order to connect to certain areas in order to migrate and move into those areas to get the green foliage. But this is becoming a problem with climate change. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. So the Perry caribou especially need to be able to jump between different islands and these higher Arctic islands in order to get there. But again, climate change is creating an issue for them to do that. So let's look at some of that migration patterns. So migration in caribou, like dolphin in the Union populations, so they typically use the ice to move across locations during the winter months. So climate change can alter this as the surface becomes warm, and this could cause them to have to use more energy just to migrate. So they would have to actually walk around rather than walk across. They can swim, but for risk reasons, they try not to do this. So they also try to avoid areas that have deep levels of snow. So climate change could also alter this as the snowfall would elevate. So it's really going to create an issue for them in terms of energy when migrating. For Perry caribou, so they use a rotation of these different islands here. You can see that in the photograph. So they will move between which areas have the best grazing during certain seasonal changes. So if an area is less desirable, they will move. So this can also protect them from predators like wolves and make them less vulnerable as they move between the two. But the reduction in the ice and the loss of this bridge, so to speak, could actually cause them to have to withstand harsh conditions and no longer be able to use this, and also put them at higher risk for predators. So really, climate change is going to affect a lot of different behavioral changes for them in terms of how they use the habitat, as well as how their migrational patterns are, especially in the way that they forage, because they look for really high lichen-rich vegetation. That's going to cause them issues as fire may increase and that vegetation may be lost, and then the lichens will have to return, and that takes quite a bit of time. So there's several ways that climate change can affect them in their habitat use and migrational patterns. So because of this, they are currently, from the IUCN, they are of least concern, but there's a lot of threats to them, and a lot of them have to do with human involvement. So oil and gas development through drilling, and then, of course, these climate change effects that we are seeing. So that does put them on the red list for vulnerable due to those current issues. So really, those changing of the climate, fire, ice, changes of vegetation, and even increased pests. So them having more pest species could even be an effect that could harm them in terms of habitat use and migration. All right, these are my sources. All right, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.